I recalled all our childhood memories, how often we walked in those last days of February with father to Rijnsberg and heard the lark over the black fields with young green corn, the radiant blue sky with the white clouds in it, and then the stony path with the beech trees. Oh Jerusalem, Jerusalem, or rather, oh Zundert, oh Zundert.
In 1853, 30th of March, Vincent van Gogh was born in this little village. It is called Groot Zundert. It's located in the southern part of the Netherlands. Back in the 1800s, this area was totally surrounded by open fields, like the field behind me. The locals call this Heiden. In English, it means heath. At that time, the village was surrounded by uncultivated lands, and there lived poor and resilient farmers. In the midst of the black soils, there stood a Protestant church where Van Gogh's father used to preach.
This church, where Vincent van Gogh's father used to preach, is not only well kept in modern days, but it is also still in service for the Protestant population from the neighboring area. Every Sunday you can still hear the beautiful hymns coming out from this church.
His father was a minister of the Protestant faith. They had to keep up appearances in the village because it was a Catholic community in the south of Holland. And there were about 4,000 people living in Zundert, in the community of Zundert altogether. And only 100 of them were of the Protestant faith. So they made them a small minority within the community, and he was not allowed to play with other children as well. And he was not allowed to play on the streets either, because most of the villagers and people were from another class, you might say. So their family was a really bourgeois family, although they were not very rich, but of course there's a certain standing of being the minister and having your own church there. And of course, when they would go to church, they would go to church every Sunday, and the whole family would sit up front next to the culprit where his father was preaching, so where the whole community could see them as well. So they had to keep up appearances, they had to dress well, they had to behave nicely, and all those things.
This is the original church where Vincent's father was the preacher. It's from 1805. You see it in the preaching chair on top of it, and it's all original. The preaching chair, the support for the Bible, and especially this one. This is where the holy water was kept from which Vincent as a child was baptized by his own father here. And each week on each Sunday the complete family was sitting here on the special seats for their family whilst Vincent's father was preaching here.
Growing up in a religious family has played an important part in Van Gogh's childhood. This environment has bestowed Van Gogh with two major pursuits in his life: his deep love for the honest, poor people who lived in very difficult conditions, and his quest for salvation through his passion for the Christian faith. The Van Gogh that we know today is a mighty art grandmaster. His greatness is also illustrated through his paintings that mainly expressed his admirations around these two topics.
One must especially have the end in mind, and the victory one would gain after a whole life of work and effort is better than one that is gained earlier. Whoever lives sincerely and encounters much trouble and disappointment, but is not bowed down by them, is worth more than one who has always sailed before the wind and has only known relative prosperity. One must never trust the occasion when one is without difficulties.
Although to young Vincent, Christianity is an inherited religion, Vincent himself was a character with religious senses.
Well, I suppose it was inescapable because it was there all the time, of course, in the family. His mother was also very devout mother, pietist, like his father, but of course it was his work. And of course it differs of how you are in your character yourself as a child. Because when, for instance, when we look at the other children, of Theo for instance, there's not really something you might say that he was very religious, or his other sisters for instance. But he caught on quite well, and he looked up to his father in a certain respect. And and at a certain point even wanted to tread in his footsteps and become a minister himself. So in a way it's inescapable, but he was vulnerable to it. So he was open to it, you might say, to these religious things. But it had to do with the Protestant faith or other religious things. That's something which would change afterwards. But of course it was there, it was important to him, yes.
After about 160 years, the little village where Vincent van Gogh was born has a total new outlook today. In the midst of the bustling street, the only original buildings left is the church where Van Gogh's father used to preach, and the city hall from across the street. It was only after Van Gogh's death that he receives tremendous fame. Thus Vincent's birth house is still kept at its original place.
Several steps away from the church, we came across Vincent van Gogh's birth house. In a lovely spring, about 160 years ago, Vincent was born in this place. In modern days, the original building has been demolished, but instead, we have a Vincent van Gogh museum for international visitors to learn more about this great artist.
Ron Derwin is the coordinator of the Vincent van Gogh's Birth House Museum in Zondert. In this building, they're preserved a few pictures, various video materials, and all the endless tales behind these belongings of the famous yet mysterious artist.
So here we see Vincent, all of his brothers and sisters. Here's Theo. And here is the gravestone of his stillborn brother, who was also called Vincent, and who was born exactly on the same day as him, 30th of March, but 1 year earlier. And he is buried next to the church here. There are his father and his mother, his 3 uncles who were in the art trade, and his grandfather, who also was a preacher, but he was a very influential preacher who worked in Breda in the great church and on the military academy there.
In our family, which is a Christian family in the full sense of the word, there has always been, as far as one can remember, from generation to generation, one who preached the gospel. Why should not a member of that family feel himself called to that service now? It is my fervent prayer and desire that the spirit of my father and grandfather may rest upon me, and that it may be given me to become a Christian and a Christian laborer, that my life may resemble more and more the lives of those named above. For behold that the old wine is good, and I do not desire a new one.
At the time when Van Gogh's father was preaching in Zondert, the Netherlands was experiencing huge contradictions between the Catholics and the Protestants. At that time, the Protestant Church had more dominance in the Dutch society. The northern part of the Netherlands was mainly occupied by Protestant people. But in the southern part, there still remained a small Catholic population. Up until now, there are still different opinions about Van Gogh's father from the 2 religious groups.
He was a friendly man, and he liked to walk through the village with his wife and children. And Vincent also loved Zundert especially.
In the center of Zundert, there was the house of the Reverend and the little church. And around that were the poor Catholics, but around that there were the great land estates from the very, very rich people, as we are here now. And the father of Van Gogh was the Reverend, and he got his money from those 30, 40 rich people. And 3,000-4,000 Catholics were very poor and worked as a kind of slaves, as I always say, for those rich people. So that was the reason that they were enemies from each other. They didn't like each other. As the Van Goghs were isolated in this region, and as they say, it's one of the reasons that he got very depressed on later age.
However, regardless of what others may think, Vincent admired his father dearly from a very young age.
Groot Zundert, it was a very small village in a large area of very uncultivated nature. And Vincent's father was placed here by his grandfather. Vincent's father wasn't such a very good speaker, therefore he got those very small villages to become a preacher. And he was actually proud of it himself, and he called it the standing post on the hay. And also Vincent was proud of that, because he admired that in his father, and he followed that kind of image also for himself. He wanted, he searched those little villages also to become a preacher, painter, in a manner of speaking.
Because of the nature of his work, Van Gogh's father always had to travel very far distances to reach out to his congregation. He often went on preaching together with his children. Strolling in the nature while enjoying the beautiful creations by the hands of God is considered one of the happiest growing up experiences for little Vincent. This unusual intimacy with nature has helped Van Gogh later in his life and became the healing potion whenever he tasted the bitterness of life's struggles. In the outskirts of North Brabant, there are large tracts of heather flower fields. Van Gogh often mentioned in his letters that whenever his mind is going through dire straits, he could often find peace within the heather flower fields. 10 years later, on an occasion where he had traveled back home for a visit, he wrote a letter to Theo.
My journey began with a good 6 hours walk across the heath to Hoogeveen on a stormy afternoon in rain and snow. That walk greatly cheered me up, or rather, my feelings were so in sympathy with nature that it calmed me. I thought that perhaps my going back home would give me a clear insight into questions of how to act.
Throughout his entire life, apart from his father, Van Gogh was closest to his first younger brother, Theo. Theo is younger than Van Gogh by 4 years. He was the second eldest son of the family.
Although Van Gogh did not have many friends during his childhood, he and his younger brother Theo became inseparable from a very early age. In his 600+ letters to his beloved brother Theo, he wrote intricately about his work, ambitions, dreams, life struggles, and shared with Theo the most detailed inner thoughts. These became the most powerful, if not the only, sources for us to understand this great artist after his death.